On Saturday night, the world watched the United States do something it had not done in decades. It stormed the heart of a foreign capital, Caracas, and by morning Nicolás Maduro was gone. More than 100 people were dead, according to Venezuela's own interior minister. Soldiers, Cubans, bodies that rarely make it into official speeches. And then, almost casually, Donald Trump turned his gaze west toward Colombia, a man he had mocked, threatened, insulted. Suddenly, Trump was praising the Colombian president's tone. Suddenly, a White House meeting was back on the table. This is not chaos. It is power in motion. Because drugs, oil, and presidents are not separate stories in Latin America. They are one system. And when Washington moves one piece, the others react sometimes violently. If you want to understand what just happened and why it matters far beyond Venezuela or Colombia, stay with me. Because the real story begins beneath the headlines, and it starts with the question of leverage. And that question leads us directly to the problem at the center of this moment. To understand this moment, we have to slow it down and name the problem clearly. The United States is no longer just responding to events in Latin America. It is reshaping them. On one side, Venezuela, a direct operation. A president seized control over oil sales, declared indefinite. This is raw, unapologetic force. On the other, Colombia, a country deeply entangled with the drug trade, rich in oil, gold, coal, and influence. Led by a president Washington has sanctioned, insulted, and accused of letting cocaine flood the United States. And yet this same president is now being welcomed to the White House. That contradiction is not accidental. It is the point. Trump threatens, Trump insults, Trump applies pressure. Then, when leverage is established, he pivots to dialogue. This is not about personal diplomacy. It is about systems, how drugs, energy, and regime survival intersect, and how power is applied not evenly, but strategically. To see why this strategy looks familiar and why it keeps repeating, we need to step back into the deeper history that shaped it. To grasp why this pattern repeats, we have to look at the structural backdrop, not individual leaders. For decades, the United States has viewed parts of Latin America through two lenses at once: instability and resources. When those overlap, intervention follows not always with troops, but always with leverage. Colombia sits at the center of this cycle. It is described as a key hub for cocaine trafficking while also holding vast reserves of oil and minerals. Those realities coexist, and they create a permanent tension between cooperation and confrontation. Venezuela follows a parallel track: oil wealth, political defiance, sanctions, and now direct action. When the White House says it will control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely, it signals something larger than punishment. It signals restructuring. What we are seeing is not a break from the past, but an acceleration of it. Pressure first, then dialogue if useful. Sanctions, then negotiations. Force, then terms. These cycles are not driven by ideology alone. They are driven by mechanisms. Who controls energy? Who controls narcotics flows? And who survives politically as a result? And once those mechanisms are activated, crisis becomes inevitable. That crisis arrived suddenly and violently in Caracas. What happened in Caracas was not a warning shot. It was the event. U.S. forces stormed Nicolás Maduro's compound in the Venezuelan capital. By the government's own account, the death toll was far higher than first reported. More than 100 people killed. Venezuelan soldiers, Cuban soldiers. A night operation that ended a presidency in hours. This was not diplomacy failing. This was diplomacy being replaced. Almost immediately, Washington moved to energy. The White House said it would control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely, even as it prepared to roll back restrictions on crude in global markets. Regime change and resource control arrived together. And then came the pivot. A few days earlier, Donald Trump had said an operation targeting Colombia sounds good. He had called President Gustavo Petro a sick man. He had warned him to watch his ass. After Caracas, the tone changed. Trump praised Petro's manner, called their conversation a great honor, announced a White House meeting. If this feels dizzying, pause for a moment. Ask yourself why force in one country suddenly creates diplomacy in another. If this analysis helps you see the pattern, stay with me. Because the real mechanism, the one that links Caracas to Bogota, is still hidden. What connects these moments is not personality. It is a mechanism. At the center of it lies leverage built from three elements already on the table: drugs, oil, and legitimacy. Start with drugs. Colombia is described as a key hub in the regional cocaine trade. The United States has accused President Petro of failing to curb trafficking, of allowing cartels to flourish. Sanctions followed, public accusations followed, pressure mounted. Drugs become more than a criminal issue, they become diplomatic currency. Then oil. Venezuela's crude is now under US control indefinitely. Colombia, like Venezuela, sits on substantial oil reserves. Energy is not just fuel here, it is bargaining power. Whoever controls access, controls outcomes. Finally, legitimacy. Seizing a president sends a message that echoes far beyond one border. It tells every neighboring leader where the red lines are and who enforces them. When these three forces align, diplomacy changes shape. Threats soften into meetings. Insults become invitations. The pressure remains, but it moves behind closed doors. This is why confrontation and cooperation can coexist. They are not opposites. They are phases of the same system. And when that system tightens, it rarely stops at governments. The next shock comes when pressure spills outward fast, unpredictable, and destabilizing. Pressure never stays contained. After Caracas, the signals multiplied. Trump did not retreat, he escalated rhetorically. He described President Petro as someone who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States. He added ominously, he's not going to be doing it for very long. This was not casual language. It was calibrated. Because in this system, words are instruments. They test reactions. They probe limits. And in Colombia, the reaction came quickly. Petro warned that if the United States launched military action against his country, Colombia would take up arms. He did not speak as a technocrat. He spoke as a leader invoking the people. If you detain a president whom much of my people want and respect, he wrote, you will unleash the people's jaguar. Two presidents, two threats, one escalating feedback loop, and yet behind the scenes, diplomacy accelerated, secretaries of state, arrangements, a visit to Washington. This is the second crisis, not an explosion of force, but an explosion of uncertainty. Allies unsure where the line is, markets watching oil, governments recalculating survival. When power moves this fast, it does not ask permission, it forces choices. And those choices do not land first on leaders. They land on people like you. When systems collide, they always fall hardest on ordinary people. If you live in Colombia, this is not an abstract debate about diplomacy. It is about stability, about whether sanctions tighten or ease, about whether your economy becomes a bargaining chip. If you live in Venezuela, the consequences are already visible. A night raid, hundreds dead, a government gone, control over oil decided elsewhere. These are not policy shifts. They are life-altering shocks. And if you live outside the region, do not assume distance protects you. Drugs, energy prices, migration, these systems do not respect borders. When cocaine production is accused of exploding, it becomes a story about public health. When oil sales are controlled indefinitely, it becomes a story about global markets. This is where I want you to pause. Because the language of power often strips away human cost. But behind every sanction, every raid, every threat, there are families absorbing the impact. If you've ever wondered how geopolitics reaches into everyday life, this is how. If this perspective resonates, share it. These stories matter when they are understood. But the ripple effects do not stop here. They move outward, across borders, across alliances, across the global system. When Washington moves in Latin America, the shockwaves do not stay regional. They travel globally. Venezuela's oil does not exist in isolation. When the United States declares it will control sales indefinitely, markets listen, energy flows tighten or loosen, prices adjust. Governments far from Caracas recalibrate policy based on decisions made overnight. Colombia, too, matters beyond its borders. It sits at the intersection of energy supply, mineral production, and narcotics routes that stretch across continents. Any instability there affects supply chains, security cooperation, and diplomatic alignments well beyond the Americas. And then there is the precedent. A president seized, sanctions imposed, dialogue reopened selectively. Other nations watch and ask a quiet question: who is next and under what conditions? This is how global order shifts, not through grand declarations, but through moments that redraw what is acceptable. What once seemed unthinkable becomes possible. What once required consensus becomes unilateral. Power, when exercised this openly, forces every actor to adapt. Allies hedge, rivals prepare. Neutral states reassess their dependence on energy, trade, and political goodwill. And as this recalibration spreads, the future stops being singular. It fragments into scenarios. From this point forward, there are three paths this system could take. The first is managed containment. The United States uses its leverage to force cooperation without further military action. Colombia's White House visit becomes a pressure valve. Drug disputes are negotiated. Energy relations stabilize. Tensions remain, but escalation pauses. The second is prolonged instability. Threats continue, sanctions expand, rhetoric hardens. Colombia and Venezuela become permanent flashpoints, neither fully cooperative nor openly hostile. Uncertainty becomes the norm, draining economies and exhausting populations. The third is open confrontation. A line is crossed, another operation, another president targeted. Regional leaders respond not with diplomacy, but with resistance. Petro's warning of taking up arms stops being symbolic. The system fractures. None of these futures depends on one leader alone. They depend on how power is exercised and how often force replaces consent. History shows that systems built on pressure can function for a time, but they also generate backlash. The question is not whether consequences arrive, but when and in what form. And that brings us to the final, unavoidable insight of this moment. What this moment reveals is not just a foreign policy choice. It reveals a philosophy of power. When presidents can be seized, oil can be controlled indefinitely, and threats can turn into invitations overnight, we are no longer talking about rules. We are talking about leverage as a governing principle. That kind of power can be effective, it can move fast, it can force outcomes, but it also carries a cost, one that compounds quietly, then suddenly trust erodes, fear replaces cooperation, and stability becomes conditional. For Colombia, for Venezuela, and for the world watching, the lesson is stark. In a system driven by pressure, no position is permanent. Ally or adversary can change in a single call. The real question for the future is not whether this strategy works in the short term. It is whether a global order built this way can endure. If you want to understand how power is actually exercised in our time, not as slogans, but as systems, stay with me. Share this perspective and watch closely. Because what happened in Caracas was not an ending. It was a signal,